So this would you So we're going to begin with a word of prayer. Would you come up and
join with me, please, in prayer. Our Father, we come with hearts that are so grateful. We have been so enriched and blessed by the fellowship together, these nice facilities, the rich teaching. Father, we're most blessed by our Lord Jesus Christ, giving himself for us to pay for our sin, and you revealing the future for us. Father, with grateful hearts, we open our hearts and minds today. We pray for our speakers that you would guide them, open us to understand. And Father, may we go forth faithfully trusting and teaching others the goodness of your word and the goodness of yourself. Bless this time now, we ask, in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Our speaker this morning, our first one, is Arnold Frichtenbaum, and he is head of Aerial Ministries that he started a number of years ago, and has a worldwide outreach, and he is our pre-trib rabbi for all these years. And Arnold, when you get going, you got to do a rabbi story. We have one every year, so he's going to do that. So,
okay.
Let her rip, Tater Chip.
Well, because I've told rabbi stories so often here, most of you probably have heard all of them. I'll tell you a story that has not a rabbi story, but does have a Jewish connection. It's a story of a Taliban terrorist running through the deserts. He's fleeing from the authorities. He's run out of water. He's getting a bit desperate. He looked up into the sky, and as far as he could see, and he noticed something looked like it's an oasis. And if it's an oasis, there'll be trees there, and there'll be water there. He was able to make it to the oasis. When he got there, there's no trees, no water. All he sees is an old Jewish man selling ties. And so the terrorist asked him, "Do you have any water here?" The Jewish man says, "Well, I have no water, but look, I have these nice ties, only $5 American a piece." The terrorist says, "I don't want your Western clothing. I am an Easterner, and I am with the Taliban. I need water." And the Jewish man says, "Well, like I told you, I have no water, but look, I've got this nice silk tie, only for $5 American. And the terrorist says, "I wish I had enough strength right now to take the tie and put it around your neck and squeeze you to death. I hate Jews. I love to kill Jews. But I need to preserve my energy. I need to find water." And the Jewish man says, "Well, I'll show you I'm a better man than you are. You hate me because I'm Jewish. You won't even buy any one of my ties, but I'll show you I'm a better man. If you simply walk straight in this direction, walk for about another kilometer, you'll come to a crossroads. And the crossroads is a nice restaurant that has all the water you could possibly want. So go in peace and may God bless you." As the terrorist leaves, he says, "I may come back and kill you yet, but I will need to get some more water." He's gone for a while, but he comes back. He's crawling on his knees, crawling on his hands. He's very close to dying. He has a $5 bill in his hand, and he says, "They would not let me in without a tie." Okay, anybody here that did not get a copy of this when they came in, raise your hand. We'll get it to you real quick, okay? Keep your hands up, and we'll get it passed out to you really quick. This will help you kind of follow what I'll be saying. I'd like to begin reading two passages from the Gospel of Luke, so you can turn to Luke chapter 19. On this ride into Jerusalem in fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, and while he's being proclaimed to be the Messiah by the multitude, by this time they've already went beyond the point of no return, so when he speaks what he's already spoken of previously, words of judgment. So chapter 19 and verse 41. And when he drew nigh, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which belong unto peace, but now they are hid from your eyes. For the day shall come upon you when your enemy shall cast up a bank about you, and compass you round, and keep you in on every side, and shall dash you to the ground, and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone on top of another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Skipping over to chapter 21 and verse 24, 21, 24. They shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. 40 years after these words were spoken, the legions of Rome invade the land, and after a 4-year war and a 2-year siege, the city was destroyed, the temple torn down till there is no one stone on top of another, and the Jewish people scattered and dispersed throughout the world. And at this point, our history goes to the period we call the diaspora, the worldwide scattering of the Jewish people. And the son of the founder of what is now Chosen People Ministries was very active in prophetic conferences in the early 1900s and the mid-1900s. And he often heard a common saying, in fulfillment of Bible prophecy, you'll find the Jews in all 7 continents, except for the continent of the Antarctica. After he heard it one more time, he began to smirk and nudged the person next to him and says, that's not a true statement. It's not true that you'll find the Jews everywhere in the world except the Antarctica. You'll find the Jews even in the Antarctica, because everyone has heard about the icebergs. If you know something about Jewish name, you got the pun. And the history kept repeating itself. A Jewish community will find itself settled in some sector of Europe, even living comfortably for a while, but eventually some anti-Semite gains control of that section. In the name of Jesus, they would drive the Jews out. And what is sad is that from the 4th century, 95% of all persecutions against the Jews were in the name of the 3 C's, the church, the cross, and Christ. And so a natural barrier developed in the Jewish mind between us and them. Us are the Jews, and them are the Christians who kill Jews in the name of somebody called Christ, and either kill them or drive them out. And that's why there is this immediate barrier in the Jewish mind when he's confronted with the issue of Yeshua, of Jesus being the Messiah. And most Jewish people today are not actually rejecting the Yeshua of the scriptures. They're reacting to the Christ of church history, and that is a major barrier in Jewish evangelism. Now, there was a period of time from the 1700s that Poland was opened up for Jewish immigration, and so Jews began migrating into Poland. And in the course of time, Poland had the largest Jewish community in the world, about 3 million Jews. And it was among the Polish Jews that a new sect began to develop called the Hasidim. And the Hasidim are the ultra-Orthodox, means the pious ones. And they demanded a very strict adherence to the Mosaic Code, but also demanded a very strict adherence to many of the regulations and rules and traditions that the rabbis have passed down over the centuries. And when the founder of the movement passed away, it divided into various divisions, not so much based on theology, but on geography. And in each section, there was a leader that was not a rabbi in the normal term. He was referred to as a rabbi. A rabbi's authority was much stronger than that of a regular rabbi, and often the authority was passed down dynastically from father to son. And in the specific section of Poland, a branch of the Hasidic movement fell under the authority of the Fruchtenbaum family. And so we have a rather lengthy history of father to son to grandson, so on. They became leaders of this ultra-Orthodox group. And he was a member of the Ger or Gur Hasidim, one branch of the Hasidic movement. Now, on the top of your page here, you have a name, Baruch Simcha Fruchtenbaum. He was the Rebbe in a town called Pultusk, and Pultusk is about 80 kilometers, 50 miles north of Warsaw. And they had a very sizable Jewish community, about 15-something, even more than 50% before the Second World War. And he was married to a woman named Ita Leah Greenbaum. Now, keeping with the Jewish practice of that day, the Baruch and Ita Leah met each other on their wedding day. It was all arranged by the parents on both sides. And so they met each other on their wedding day. I assume they got along because they did produce 12 children. Now, 2 of them died either at birth or shortly thereafter, but 10 survived the birth. And he was so very strict with his Hasidic Judaism. He never got a job that would earn any money. He was dependent upon contributions. He was a teacher in the local synagogue, Hasidic synagogue in Pultusk. And he had very limited knowledge outside the Bible and outside rabbinic writings. And as far as this little town or city, the only thing he knew is how to get from the home to the synagogue and back. If he wandered outside that basic route, he would get lost, needed to be found by one of his children to be brought back home. Now, he had a son that was his firstborn son, Yitzhak Meir. And Yitzhak Meir had a relationship with Haya that gave birth to Chaim. Chaim is my father. And he married Adele, and that's how I came into being. And Yitzhak Meir was born, and in 1911 he developed scarlet fever. He was cured of it, and survived it. However, it made him very weak and a weak heart. He survived another 10 years, and he rebelled against being raised so ultra-Orthodox, and Baruch Simcha wanted him to follow in his footsteps and become a leader of this branch of the Hasidic movement. Yitzhak Meir simply refused. He became much more secular. In place of studying rabbinics, he chose to study music. He became a very good violinist. So when he practiced his violin, the neighbors outside in this neighborhood would take out their chairs and listen to his violin music from inside his house or apartment while he was practicing the violin. And sadly, his weakness finally got the better of him, and he died in the year 1921. The possibility he lived to 1924, and that the family wasn't too clear on exactly when he died, but somewhere between 1921 and 1924. Now, Baruch Simcha Fruchtenbaum wrote a number of books about expositions of rabbinic writings and so on that did not survive the war. When his son died, his firstborn son, he wrote a book called Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son, my son, quoting David when he lost his son. And there was a very, from what I know, from the family members who knew the book, it was a very tearful book, and he mourned over the death of his firstborn son. And but that book did not survive the Holocaust either. So what happened is that his girlfriend, they were never actually married, was that rebellious against Jewish morals and so on. They produced a son, Chaim, my father, but the widow could not take care of him, so she turned my father to the family of Baruch Simcha Fruchtenbaum. And he was raised by his very strict grandfather, and he was raised in very strict Ger Hasidic theology and things of that nature. And because Baruch Simcha and Ita Leah had so many children, he came up out in the middle as far as his age, so he had all the other children that were older than he were his aunts and uncles, and the other children that also came later were his aunts and uncles, but they were younger than him. And so he actually was older than some of his aunts and uncles. And his life was also that strict. Now, when the war finally broke out, What the family was is they were mostly still in the city of Poltos, but the Yaakov, who was now the oldest son since the firstborn son died, was in Poltos, but his wife and son were not with him. They were in Warsaw. And at that point, my father was also in Warsaw since he was being trained to be a photographer. Most of the family was in Poltusk. And the Germans captured Poltusk before they were able to capture Warsaw. Initially, what they did was gather the whole Jewish community, quite sizable, in place of any kind of mass killing, though some killing occurred. They simply chased them away from the town of Poltusk, and that's why many of the Jews of Poltusk did survive. They have an annual remembrance in Israel every year of the Jewish community of Poltusk. And so what the two brothers, Jacob and Joshua, or Yaakov and Yehoshua, did was take the lead and move their family 70 kilometers to a city where they can catch a train, hoping to get to the section of the Russian zone. But the war had interrupted everything, no trains were coming. So for the time being, they decided to go back to Poltusk. On the way back, a bus came by, and on the thing you mentioned, it was heading for Warsaw. So Jacob fanned the bus down. He got on the bus to head for Warsaw to see if he could find his wife and children in Warsaw, losing contact with them when the war began on September 1, 1939. And I'll get back to the story a bit later, but the rest of the family temporarily got back to Poltusk, and they stayed in Jacob's apartment. But then the SS came over and took over from the Wehrmacht, and when the SS took over, it was much more strict, much more vicious, much more terroristic with the Jewish people living in Poltusk. And all the Jews were gathered into the park in the center, and they had to empty their pockets of any money, any jewelry. And if any Jew was found hiding something, he would be immediately shot. So quite a few of the Jews got shot, both male and female, in this town. Joshua very quickly organized his family and began to move them out of the town. It was able to escape, and now they began a journey on foot that would be about 250 kilometers to the Russian zone. What I mean by the Russian zone is that when Hitler and the Soviets made the treaty, Poland was divided between the Nazi occupation and the Russian occupation. And so the attempt now was trying to flee over to the Russian zone, the Russian occupation of that section of Poland on the east, but also Lithuania and Estonia and so on. And it was rather, the way they described the journey, it was a very hard journey, very difficult. But about halfway, they finally found someone they knew driving a wagon, and they were able to put the women on the wagon and Yehoshua's daughter Esther, and then they continued the trek. But they were trying to move and move and move because the Russians would want to close the bridge at midnight, and it would not be opened again. And they had only till midnight to get across. And every time the family just wanted to give up, Yehoshua would say, no, just a little bit, we're almost there, and kept on hour after hour. Look, we're almost there, And finally, just not be long before midnight, they got to the bridge and crossed over and was safely in the Russian zone. Meanwhile, back in Warsaw, my uncle Jacob Yaakov bought my father a bicycle for him to go up to Poltusk to see what happened to the family. He got to Poltusk, and the whole family was gone. He didn't know what happened to them. And the neighbors told him all they know is that they left, but nobody knew where they left. No one knew if they were still living. And so he came back and informed Jacob, and then he went on and got over to the Russian zone. Yaakov could not find his wife and his son in Warsaw. They were not in the place where they normally would have been. And after a while, when the Germans started coming into Warsaw, he fled into the Russian zone, but he was actually arrested and sent into a Siberian concentration camps in the far north of Siberia, where he would be, well, he was able to survive another 2 or 3 years. And what happened in the meantime is that while he was there, my father was still living freely in the Soviet zone, not the Russian zone on the east. Now, I might point out that Baruch Simcha Fruchtenbaum, he died in 1931 of appendicitis, so he did not live to see the war, but his wife did. And because he was always poor, never worked for a living, only teaching, for which he got very little donations. But he did die before the war, and his firstborn son also died before him. But now we're talking for what's happening to the family within the war context. Once they crossed into the Soviet zone, what they did was move into the city of Vilna, the capital of Lithuania, and they would be there from 1939 to 1941 in a safe zone. But in a safe zone, meaning they were working, living under Russian authority, did not mean that life was good for them. They have to keep struggling for food. And so Yehoshua with his two brothers, Asher and Semach, would make scourges into areas to find food. They also did little works, doing little jobs like buying linen from one side of the border, crossing over and selling it for a higher price and so on, and were able to help the family survive. But they suffered very strong anti-Semitism from the Lithuanians that were living there, and also from the many of the Polish Gentiles that also fled into the same region. And my father, Chaim, who was always more sensitive to possible dangers than other members of the family, he did not feel comfortable that the family should stay in Vilna. He felt very strongly that eventually the contract, the treaty between Stalin and Hitler would be broken, and the Nazis would come into the rest of Poland and into Lithuania. So he came into Vilna. He begged his family to get out of the city. But they were living somewhat comfortable, although of course always hungry, and they felt my father was simply exaggerating his fears, and they did not feel that they were really in that much danger. And so they refused to leave, so he left on his own, went back into the Russian zone, and I'll come back to his story a bit later. Now, Huma, who was the youngest of the siblings in that family, she met a man named Abek while doing this first 2 years in the Vilna ghetto, and they were married in the Vilna ghetto. But they won't stay married long, as I point out. Then came the year 1941 until 1943. In 1941, Hitler did break his treaty with Stalin and invaded the Russian zone, and ultimately also invaded Russia itself. And now the family was living under Nazism, and their freedom of movement was very limited. And all the Jews in the city of Vilna were now gathered together and moved into a walled-in ghetto. And what the Nazis would do periodically is perform what they called an action. An action was an action, but targeting certain age groups and certain things of that nature. So one day they decreed that all young Jewish men, not children and not older men, but all young Jewish men of working age would need to gather into the center of the ghetto, and they would be moved to go to Estonia at a work camp. This was just being deceptive. So instead, all the Jewish young men were taken into a nearby forest called Ponar, P-O-N-A-R, or Ponari, sometimes spelled that way, P-O-N-A-R-I, and they were standing aside ditches, and bit by bit they were all shot. And that included certain members of my family. And so on that occasion, Asher and Semach were shot, who were blood members of the family, and then the other two men, who were Abel and Joseph, who were married to two of the Fruchtenbaum sisters, were also shot. And that's the way the first 4 members of the family were perished. Meanwhile, during the different actions, the family was able to build a little secret hiding place above the ceiling and above the roof and below the ceiling, the attic, I should say, where they would hide and not help them out for a while. Now, after Huma lost her husband, she was able to get out of the ghetto, and she was able to hide in a nunnery, in a monastery of nuns, who were very protective of any Jewish people that came to them. And so she hid there for a while, but eventually she felt she had to get back to her family periodically. And the Mother Superior told Huma that if she can smuggle any members of her family, especially the 2 children of Hava and Yosef, Gutka and Frumka, then they'll protect the children for the remainder of the war. But the mother, Hava, just had lost her husband in the Panari forest, and she said, "No, I will not give my children up, because if I die, they'll need to die with me, because without a mother, the children will have no hope." And she essentially sealed the death sentence for her 2 children. And Huma often told me she had no right to make that decision, but the decision she made, but those 2 daughters could have been saved otherwise. And then on September in 1943, the Nazis announced a liquidation of the ghetto, and all Jews would be moved to different parts, to different labor camps. So all the Jews were now gathered, and there was, as they came out of the gate of the ghetto, there was a Nazi making a selection: left, right, left, right, left, right. And so all the men and women were first of all separated from each other. And I don't know what happened on the male side, but I know from the female side, because 2 of them survived. And then so 2 of my aunts, or 2 of my father's aunts, who were Hanka and Genya, were moved to the left. And they could tell that all the women on that side were younger, working type women, and therefore knew they were selected for now at least to survive for a while. But those who went to the right were going to be exterminated. And so she noticed that, of course, her mother, who was now elderly, they painted her face up and so on to make her look younger, but did not work. She was sent to the right. And also Hava and her 2 daughters were sent to the right. And also there was Ada, who was young enough to be sent to the left, but because she did not feel the right to abandon Hava and her 2 daughters, she stayed on the right-hand side. And so these are the ones on the right-hand side were sent to Treblinka. And in Treblinka is where they, upon arrival, they'll also be executed through the gas chambers and so on. So at that point, Italea was executed, also Ada, also the 2 daughters of Hava and she herself, and so on. Only ones to survive, well, for now, was Genya and Hanka. And by the time they arrived for execution into Treblinka, it was September 26, 1943. I make that point is because on that same day in faraway Siberia, I was born. The same day these family members were executed, died, murdered, that was the day I was born far away in Siberia. Now let's talk about the 2 sisters that went to the left side, Genya and Hanka. They were sent into initially a concentration camp in a section called Kaiserwald, and then they were moved into Strashof, which was near the city of Riga in Latvia. But then when the Russian army was slowly moving against the German forces, then the 2 sisters were sent to a concentration camp in a place called Stutthof on the very north end of Poland. And when the Russian armies continued to move, Well, at Stutthof, they suffered a lot of the SS mistreatment and things of that nature, but they were mostly, as long as they stayed healthy to work, they would be able to live. Those who did not stay active to work would be executed. And so when the Russians began to draw near that particular Stutthof concentration camp, all the Jews that were in there were organized. It was already in the winter. It was very cold, a lot of snow, and now they began a death march from northern Poland moving into what was then Prussia, which is now part of Germany. And one by one, they could hear shots. If anyone fell and couldn't move, they would be shot on the ground and abandoned and things of that nature. And periodically, Hanka would want to give up, and she was willing just to die, but Genya kept saying, no, we must live. We must live to tell the story. For the sake of the family, we must continue living, and kept carrying Hanka. Sometimes it was the other way around. But and when they get to a certain point, the Nazis found an empty barn and put all the women into that barn. And the woman knew nothing why this was done and so on, but the Russians were very close to the German heels. And when they woke up the next morning, they discovered they were now under Russian authority. The Russians had moved into that section. And they were treating the Jewish people well. They provided housing because all of the Germans of that area abandoned because of the Russians coming. They were able to live in a German house for a while. They were taken care of by Jewish Russian doctors and so on. But they knew they couldn't stay there indefinitely. They were warned by the Jewish doctor to go back to Poland because Poland had been liberated from the Nazis. And so they moved to a city called Lodz. Lodz kind of became the Jewish capital, not literally a capital, but the capital of the survivors. And as far as they knew at this point, they were the only two surviving members of the family. Now, Huma was able to escape from the ghetto before the liquidation. She spent more time in the monastery, but she felt she cannot keep hiding in the monastery. She had to go and fight the Germans. So she escaped into the occupied sections, but in the forest, and she joined up a group known as the partisans. The partisans were made up of Jews and Russians, and some others that were attacking German soldiers from the forest escape. So she was fighting against the Germans here and there for the next 2 years. And and whenever anyone tried to get nasty with her, there was one Jewish Russian soldier named Reuven, and he was protecting her. Eventually, that's the one whom I got married to, since her first husband was shot in the Ponar Forest. And when the war was finally ended, and she was now married, what they did was go back to Vilna to see if there's any remnant of the family. And they found nothing, and began moving back towards Poland. Meanwhile, Jacob was released from the Siberian imprisonment. He went right straight to Vilna, which was the last place he knew the family was, trying to find out if there are any family members that survived. And somebody told him no single member of the Fruchtenbaum family survived, not a one. And he got so deep in mourning that, according to the family, within one night, his hair turned white and stayed white from then on, all in one night. But through some other connections later, he found out that Huma had survived, and they connected. And then they also, through some other ties, they also connected with the two sisters, now in Lodz. And so now it was the two women, the two sisters, Hanka and Genya in Lodz, Huma and her husband in Lodz, and Jacob in Lodz. And much later is when my mother and my father came to Lodz. So now I'll pick up the story from where I left off. Now, when my father realized that the Russians were going to lose the Russian zone, he decided to escape into Russia. Now he was in Russia proper. It wasn't just the Russian zone, but the Russian country itself. He was arrested when he crossed the border because he had no documents and no the official travel documents. And so he was arrested by the Russians, and they accused him of being a spy. And he was warned by the other Jewish people in the prison is that whatever they accuse you of, just agree. Just agree. And so when he first appeared before the judge said, you are a Finnish spy. Because there was a war between Russia and the Finns. My father's never been in Finland. He didn't know anything about Helsinki, didn't know any streets. And so he said, yes, I am a Finnish spy. Began dealing out the passes. Okay, what city did you live in? He never was in Helsinki, but the only Finnish city he knew. And then what's the name of the street you were living on? Well, he didn't know how to say any streets in Helsinki, nor did he speak the Finnish language, so he gave them the street he lived in Warsaw, but it was a Polish name. So they put him back in the cell, and then later on they called him back and says, you were not a Finnish spy, you were from Poland. And again, my father learned to agree. So since you came from that side, you must be a German spy. Now they know he was Jewish. Although he was a Jew, they accused him of being a Nazi spy and shipped him out to a concentration camp into Siberia. On the way, and he was on the train to Siberia, and the train came under aerial attack from the Germans, but they were able to. There was some damage on the train, but not really very much. And by the way, when my family was leaving Pultos, trying to get to the Russian zone, at one point the Luftwaffe, the air force of the Germans, began an air attack. My family hid into a ditch and they survived, but those who didn't run into the ditch, most of them were killed by the gunfire. And now my father was also attacked by the Luftwaffe as a result of his moving into Siberia. Upon arrival, he spent 2 years in a Siberian work camp. That was not a death camp, that's what the Nazis had. But then came 1941 when Germany broke the treaty with Stalin and invaded Russia. At that point, the Russian government was in need of the support of the Polish government, now exiled in England. They made a request for the support, and when the Polish government met, they agreed, but they laid down certain preconditions. And one of these conditions was the release of all Polish citizens from Russian prisons and Russian camps and so on. And so for that reason, my father got released. For the same reason, by the way, Menachem Begin got released. Menachem Begin went on to become the Prime Minister of Israel. My father went on to become a professional photographer, but that's a different story. But he chose to stay in Siberia because the Nazis were still occupying much of European Russia. And so he was able to make a living by providing photographs. So many people needed passport-type pictures for identification papers and other IDs. And so he was able to make a decent living making that through his photography business. Now, my mother was actually born and raised in Russia. She grew up in what was then called the Autonomous German Republic, which was many Germans that had moved into that section of Russia under Catherine the Great, and they maintained their German culture, their German language, but they were under, at that point, Soviet authority. And my mother grew up into that segment, and she grew up in a city called Saratov on the Volga. It had also a synagogue there. But she was raised more along the of atheism, and her father was actually a member of the Communist Party, but he was not a Russian. And so when Stalin began his purge of non-Russians, my father was accused of failure in his work and so on. He was imprisoned and later shot. And then when the Germans were moving into Russia, what Stalin did was dissolve the autonomous German Republic. And all of the people, whether they were German or non-German, but living there, like my mother, they were shipped into Siberia. And she was just, at that point, she was 17 years old. And she was moved into the city on the Urals, and a city called Tobolsk, and that's where my father was now working as a photographer. And they happened to run into each other because mother was looking for a place to live, and my father simply saw how pretty she was, so he told her he was moving out of his apartment so she can take his. And so that was the only meeting they had for 10 months. When she turned 18, then she had to get some identification papers, and she knew about him being a photographer, so she went to him. That's the second meeting, and she had her picture taken, and I developed. That's when they shortly got married, and as a result, I was born in Tobolsk in 1943, and that will help to explain one segment of the accent that you're listening to. Now, when the war ended, all those who were Polish citizens were free to go back to Poland, because Poland had been fallen under communism, so no longer political differences. And so my parents began to move back towards Poland, and they went through Saratov, my mother's hometown, and she was left behind with me because I had fallen rather badly sick, I was told, having the whooping cough. And she would stay until I recovered. Meanwhile, he would go into study in the Ukraine before moving into Poland. So he got into Ukraine and found a job with a photography studio. And when I recovered, she began taking a train ride to get to where he was. And she had no address to go to. There were no train schedules that she could give him. And so she got off the train, she walked around, and finally a young teenager ran up to her and says, "You must be Adele." And she says, "Yes, I am. How did you know?" "Well, your husband works in the same shop that I work at, and he showed me your picture, and you look just like your picture." And so that's how they got reunited. And we spent 18 months in that city in the Ukraine, but then my mother developed typhus fever and was hospitalized. My father had to work every day, so I was put into an orphanage. But it was an orphanage where the orphans were not well taken care of. It turned out that the women in charge of the orphans were taking the food for themselves and giving the children almost nothing. The only food I got to eat is that every day after work, my father would come in and give me a couple of slices of bread, and that was my meal for the day. But as more and more children were dying in the orphanage, somebody warned my father that if he doesn't get me out of there, according to my mother's description, I was just skin and bones. If they don't get me out of there, I'm going to die. So my father took me out. He found a woman to take care of me in the house while he was able to continue working to make whatever money he could make. And so what happened was that it took another 2 or 3 months before my mother fully recovered. We finally moved back into Poland, not to Poltos. It was dangerous for Jews to go there, but he already knew about the family who survived were all now in Lodz, and that's where we went to. And that's where all the survivors were able to finally get together. And we lived in Poland for about a year, and that will help to explain a second segment of the accent you're listening to. Now, what happened is that when the Jewish Passover began to arrive, and the mothers began to prepare the unleavened bread for the Passover, a small 3-year-old Roman Catholic boy disappeared. And the church leaders began spreading a rumor that in order for the Jews to make unleavened bread for the Passover, we had to have the blood of a Christian. And accused of killing this 3-year-old boy, using his blood to make unleavened bread for the purpose of observing the Passover, totally ignorant of Jewish laws about the treatment of human blood. And so what happened is, on the first night of Passover, as we sat down outside our ghetto, also the ghettos around the country, Polish mosques were formed with the help of the Polish police and led by black-robed priests waving crosses. and Jewish sections were raided, and Jews were killed once again in the name of the church, the cross, and Christ. It was that action that inspired what was then, it would not be called the Israeli underground. Back then it was called the Palestinian underground. The word Palestine applied to Jews in those days. And so the Palestinian underground, called the Aliyah Bet, were able to work with the German border police, and they bribed them with both money but also with American cigarettes. American cigarettes were highly valued in East Europe after World War II, so for a carton of Camels you could purchase the freedom of family of Jews. And then word reached us to the Jewish underground that we had that 30-day period to make the crossing. And so at that point my parents decided to leave. We joined up with other Jews that made the same decision. But during this period of time in Poland, anti-Semitism was again rising, and Jews traveling on trains would be sometimes pulled out by the Polish Gentiles and killed or shot off the train. As they told us to avoid attracting attention, they were not to use any transportation. We were only to go on foot from Lodz down to what was then Czechoslovakia, but the Czech side of Czechoslovakia, where the arrangements were made. So my parents took only what we could carry. We joined up with other Jews that made the same trek. We arrived at the border. We identified ourselves as Jews. And so the Polish border guards took the rifles, put it behind their backs, raised their eyes upward, and went like so. Afterwards, they would look at the birds flying by while we crossed the border, pretending they could not see us. And so that's how we got out. And mostly it got out because of American cigarettes. So while smoking is bad for your health, it was good for mine. And that was one day I really did walk a mile for a camel. For a short while, we were in no man's land between Czechoslovakia and Poland. The Israeli underground, which was not called at that point the Palestinians, and these were all Jews, not Arabs, these were all Jews, got us organized into and walking through certain paths in different sections. They were able to supply food, and for the next few months, we simply walked, in my case, either walked or riding my father's shoulder, and the many miles to the Czech-Austrian border. They worked out a similar arrangement with the Czech border guards. The day before we were scheduled to cross the border, the Czech government collapsed, and the communists took over the government. All of the Czech border guards with whom arrangements had been made were removed and replaced by Russian border police. And no arrangements were made with the Russians. So they told us to stay hidden in the forest. They went into the border village to find out what the situation was, and what they discovered was that the Russians were given orders not to allow anyone across the border except for Greeks. Greeks recently released from prisons and heading back to their own homeland. So learning that, they came back to where we were hiding in the forest, and were told to burn, destroy everything that would identify who and what we were. All birth certificates, all passports, any communication papers went into smoke. Next morning, we were told to pose as Greeks. And posing as Greeks, we approached the Russians at the Czech-Austrian border. Now, not one of us was a Greek. Not one of us could speak a word of Greek, but neither could the Russians. So because of that, we were able to go across safely. At the last minute, something went wrong. We never knew what. One of the Israelis was shot and killed, but everyone else made it across safely into Austria, posing as Greeks. So I find myself as a unique individual of Romans 1:16, in that I was a Jew first and then also a Greek. At that point, the American MPs took over, got us through Austria into what was then West Germany, into the American zone of West Germany. For the next 5 years, we lived in camps called displaced persons camps. And we lived in 6 different displaced persons camps in different parts of Germany. And as these camps began to decline, as Jews were able to be immigrated into various countries. But they had to go through a vetting process to make sure there was no communistic connections and things of that nature. Neither my mother or my father ever were members of the Communist Party. And so what happened, so we had to be vetted for 5 years. That's why I find the silliness in the American system today, where people can just cross the border, and there's no vetting process and things of that nature. And when Germany let all of these people in without any vetting process, like we had to undergo in the American zone of Germany, that's why they're having now terroristic problems in Germany they did not have before. But we had to be very, very, very vetted. And after 5 years, we finally got our immigration status. Now, before that, we were still living in a place called Ulm, which was our second DP camp. In Ulm, there was a German minister, Lutheran minister, who was also representing what was then the American Board of Missions to the Jews. This is the same as the Chosen People Ministries today. And they happened to have a magazine called The Chosen People, which is a bit different the way the magazine looks today. But on every month, the cover was the same except for the date. On the bottom of the cover was the New York headquarters address. Now, the pastor did not tell my mother anything about the organization, and he didn't give her the whole magazine. All he did was he tore the cover off and told her that when we come to America, we should look them up, and they should be able to help us. All she understood was this was a Jewish organization that would help immigrant Jews in America, which it was doing. It was a bit more than that, and by the time my mother found that out, it was too late in my case. And as a result, what happened was after we settled in a Jewish neighborhood of Brooklyn, she took a subway ride to Manhattan. And she visited the headquarters ministry, and the day she was there, she couldn't talk to anybody because she did not as yet speak English. And nobody there could speak Russian, Polish, Yiddish, and German, all which my mother spoke. All that got done on that day is all our name and address was written down, and we were told we'd be contacting sometime later. Sometime later was 6 years later. The follow-up program was a bit weak at this stage. So nothing for 6 years. I grew up in the very strong Jewish neighborhoods of Brooklyn. And my whole world was a Jewish world. I went to public school, but 99% of everybody there was also Jewish. My contact with Christians, with Gentiles, was minimal, and if I ran into any real believers, I'm not aware of it. But eventually, they opened up a new branch, and they gave out the 3x5 cards where they had addresses, and a card that was pulled out 6 years earlier, filled in 6 years earlier, was given to a woman worker named Ruth Wardell. And Ruth Wardell came and invited my family to attend what she called a Jewish Christian meeting, which to me was a contradiction in terms. I decided to go anyway, just out of curiosity. And so we went into, when the meeting time, I went, as there was a very small hallway, very small a very small hall in a building. I sat in the back, listened to what they were saying. It didn't bother me too much that this were Jewish people talking about someone named Jesus. I was already expecting that much because of what I was told earlier. What's bothering me that night is they kept using the Hebrew Bible to do it with. And I grew up to believe that we have our Bible, the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament. That was not what we called it. And that Christians had their own Bible, the New Testament, and we know that their Bible talked about some God named Jesus. He was not supposed to be anywhere in my Hebrew Bible. And that was making me a bit upset. Well, Ruth Waddell, who saw what was happening, did not try to argue with me. She simply gave me a challenge to take the New Testament home and read it and see if he didn't do what the Messiah was supposed to do. And I said, okay, I'll do that, not because I was open-minded, I wasn't, but because I was going to prove these schizophrenics who think they can be Jews and Christians at the same time wrong. So I went home and read, and what I thought I would read and what I actually was reading was radically different. What I thought I would read was about these big church edifices with stained glass windows, people bowing to statues and images and priests waving crosses and telling the people, go out there and kill Jews in Jesus' name. So that's what we saw. So those who call themselves Christians doing in Europe, we simply assumed that is from their Bible. To my surprise, it's a very Jewish book. Even the first sentence was surprising because it says, this is the generation of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. You cannot get more Jewish than that line is. And the Jewishness of it intrigued me. So when I came back to the meeting hall the second time, I wasn't so angry. And what we did, I sat down with Ruth Wardell. We went from the Hebrew Bible prophecies and how they were full New Testament. So that night I became a believer in the Messiah and became a schizophrenic myself. And that led to my salvation. My parents never came to believe. My mother's still living. She's 95 years old. Every time we get into anything spiritual, she shuts the doors right away. I have two brothers and four sisters. One brother born in Germany, one sister born in Germany, one brother born in Brooklyn, and the other three sisters were born in Los Angeles, but that was after I was expelled from home. As for the rest of the family, only my father chose to try to escape and then move into a displaced persons camps, one of several, and begin the process of being vetted and receiving the immigration papers, but which took 5 years to get. The other members of the family decided none of them wanted to stay in Poland any further except for Yaakov. So bit by bit, between 1946 and 1950, all the other surviving members, their husbands that they met and married after the war, and children they had in Poland, usually only had one in Poland, the others were born in Israel, slowly migrated back to Israel. The first ones to go there is Huma and her husband Reuven, and they had one daughter, Ruthie, and the War of Independence was raging when they arrived. But the other members came in between 1948 and 1950. The one that was reluctant to go is Yaakov. He stayed in Poland until 1957. He was very good in a business sense. He was always making good money, always supporting the family, and so on. But after the Sinai campaign in 1956, anti-Semitism began to rise. And he chose to vacate Poland for Israel and was able to finally get his travel documents in 1957. And now the whole family, except my immediate family, happened to be living in Israel with their children and so on. And at this point of history, all of the other members of the Holocaust generation have now all passed away. The only one still living of that generation is my mother, and she's 95 years old. And but the others have all now passed away. But I have I don't have a good relationship with the American family. I still have a good relationship with the Israeli family. They have all abandoned not only Hasidic Judaism, but because of their experiences in the war and 6 million Jews dying and 17 members of the Fruchtenbaum family dying, that's when they gave up any belief in God. The strong Zionists, but all my members of the family are atheists in the land of Israel. And so whenever I go to Israel, I have a good time visiting with them and so on. We don't discuss religion. They know what I am, but they think it's some kind of an American aberration, and therefore they choose not to discuss it, but they are not as opposed to it as my father was, for example. And that's where we are now. Let me close with a couple other passages, and let's begin with Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus 26, verses 1 through 39, Moses spells out what ends up being Jewish history. When he wrote it, it was all prophecy. But now, the first 9 verses have been fulfilled. And he points out, along with the section Deuteronomy, that in the course of time, the Jewish people fall into disobedience or fall under different forms of divine discipline. First will be subjugation, fulfilled in the days of the judges. Secondly will come captivity, fulfilled by the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. And then thirdly, a worldwide dispersion, which ultimately came as a result of their rejection of the prophet like unto Moses. So, but in the verse 39, the worldwide dispersion is a fact. And there's still more Jews outside the land than inside the land. The Israeli Jewish population has now superseded the American Jewish population, but on a worldwide basis, the Jewish people outside the land are still more numerous. Now look at verse 40. And they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in the trespass which they trespassed against me. And also that because they walked contrary unto me, I also walked contrary unto them, and brought them into the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised heart be humbled, and they then accept of the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land. And what he points out is that God has every intention of fulfilling to the Jewish people the promises of the Abrahamic covenant, especially as it pertains to the borders of the promised land. I will remember the land. But the precondition of seeing the full fulfillment of all of the covenantal promises of the Abrahamic covenant, to really enjoy all of the promised land, enjoy settlement in all the promised land, and also to live peacefully in the promised land, is all preconditioned by Israel's finally confessing their iniquity, their rebellion against God. And so what we see today is not the end of the story. The story is yet to have a happier ending. Now go to Deuteronomy chapter 30. In chapter 29, or was the land of covenant, which has been traditionally our circles called the Palestinian covenant, though it's not an appropriate name anymore. I prefer to call it the land covenant. He points out that there will be, because of Israel's disobedience, ultimately a worldwide dispersion. And in dispersion, they'll suffer tremendous persecution, wave after wave, with the new ones being more severe as the latter ones. And although often there's been a common saying in our circles about the Holocaust, never again, never again. Sadly, I have to say there will be one more such Holocaust that will happen in the tribulation. But then he promises in chapter 30, verse 1. What's interesting is that in all forms of replacement theology, they will point out that chapter 29 has been literally fulfilled. But then don't bother reading into chapter 30. And verse 1 shall come to pass when all these things that come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have said before you, and you shall call them to mind among all the nations, where Jehovah your God has driven you. And you shall return unto Jehovah your God, and shall obey his voice according to all that I command you this day, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul, that then Jehovah your God will turn your captivity and have compassion upon you, and will return and gather you from all the peoples whither Jehovah your God has scattered you. If any of your outcasts be in the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will Jehovah your God gather you, from thence he will fetch you. And so on to the end of this chapter. And what he points out, there's going to be a time that there will be a national regeneration, a national salvation, that no matter where the Jews are living in the world at this point of time, they will all come to faith. They will all come to faith. And this is going to be our result in Israel's final restoration. Now, this is not a prophecy fulfilled with the modern Jewish state. Now, some people teach that the modern Jewish state does not fulfill any prophecies, but what we know is that the Bible prophesies two different worldwide regatherings. First of all, a worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment, which will be the judgment of the tribulation. But in that tribulation period, they'll come to faith as a nation, no matter where they're scattered. And then we'll have see the second coming, and then we'll see all the Jews return back to the land. And again, they'll have all of the land, they'll settle all of the land, and they will live in peace in the land. So again, Jewish history is yet to have a much happier ending. Now, if you want for the more details, this is a book, none of these books written by me, but this is When Your Faith Was Your Destiny. This is the history of the Fruchtenbaum family in the Holocaust, and they'll be available on the Ariel table. And everything I said from the family standards came from this volume. And then the follow-up was also written by someone else, but this is basically my biography called Chosen Fruit. And both of these books are available on the Ariel table. And a couple of books that we just recently published. It's a 2-volume called Israel Betrayed. Each volume is written by a different person. Volume Chapter 1 is by Andrew Robertson, and this is the history of replacement theology, going all the way to the oldest records of church history, and how often we can see that the reason they moved into replacement theology is because of their anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism triggered their attitude towards any future, positive future for Israel. And so this would be a book that is well documented. It goes from period of history, doesn't try to hide anything, doesn't blame everything on the Catholic Church, pointing out elements of Eastern Orthodoxy and also in Protestantism that were sadly recorded. But much of the anti-Semitism that arose was based upon, led to the nature of their theology. And while the early church was clearly premillennial until the 4th century, and they did believe in the future Messianic kingdom, they were not anywhere clear about any special role for Israel in the Messianic kingdom. So anti-Semitism crept in very early, and that accounts for not all of replacement theology, but much of it. And as a result of replacement theology, you have this one written by people you know, Paul Wilkinson, who's here for several years now. This is Volume 2, The Rise of Christian Palestinianism, and how many of the evangelical churches are moving into not just a non-support of Israel, but a very anti-Israel position. And they're actively voting for the Palestinian causes, although most of these Palestinians are clearly Muslim and anti-Christian. But these are 2 good books, and again, these will be available on the Ariel table.
It works. Yes. Well,
you've got a hand up. Let's get to the microphone.
Okay, you got to get to the microphone. That's the way it is nowadays, in these last days.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Arnold. It was really a blessing to hear your testimony and of your whole family, and I'm glad to see you here with us. But I heard you say I hear you say that at the very end that all of the Jews would be coming to Israel to be saved? Those that were alive, I guess.
Well, is the question, will all Jews going to Israel be saved? Is that a question?
Well, the question is, the Bible is, let me say, I think it's clear, but some people say that all of the Jews in the end times will be gathered back to Israel, and all of them will be saved. And others say just the ones that are in Israel will be saved. That's the question. What do you say?
Well, first of all Jews will not be back in the land till after the second coming. So even the young passage that talks about them become national salvation, he says no matter where they are in the world, no matter what country they're living in, they'll all come to faith. Now, when it says all this will be saved in Romans 11:26, it doesn't mean all Jews will be saved of all time. Only all Jews will be saved at a certain point of time, which is following the fullness of the Gentiles. The key passage here is Zechariah chapter 13, verses 8 and 9. In the tribulation, 2/3 of the Jewish population will die. But the 1/3 who survives, whether they're in the land or outside the land, the 1/3 that survives, they'll all come to faith. And lastly, all Israel will be saved. But it's not true that all Jews have to be back in the land first. The only time that all the Jews will be back in the land is after the second coming. So what you see now is the first worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment, with the second coming to be a second worldwide regathering in faith in preparation for the blessings of the kingdom.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I thought somebody else was going to ask a question.
My brother Edward became CEO of American Greetings. So, Greetings, the Goodwill company, bigger than Hallmark, according to him. And he was CEO for many years. He's retired now, but his average salary was about $600,000 a year. So I would ask people to pray for his salvation so I can collect his tithe.
Well, what do you say to these people, like the Reconstructionists and stuff, who say, oh, y'all believe 2/3 of the, Jews are going to be killed, and, they say that, we're crazy and all of this, and if you interpret those passages that way, that, we're really anti-Semitic and all of that kind of stuff. But I always like to say, heck, over half of the Gentiles are going to be killed during the tribulation as well. So what would you say in response to that passage in Zechariah 13?
Well, because first of all, I'm saying this is what Zechariah says. Yeah. Zechariah was a Jew. Yeah. So if Zechariah was anti-Semitic, then yes, I'm anti-Semitic. But he was not anti-Semitic. He was receiving a divine revelation from God. That's what he prophesied. And the 1/3 that survives will become believers. And what's following in the very next chapter, chapter 14, the second coming, in verses 1 through 15, and then the kingdom, verses 16 to 21. And so he's obviously speaking a national salvation that will trigger the second coming. Now, one of the differences between the second coming and the rapture is right there. Rapture has no preconditions. It's God's program for the church. The second coming does have a precondition. It's part of God's program for Israel. And so we have to teach what the Bible teaches, and that's what it teaches. But it doesn't make us anti-Semitic unless you make Zechariah anti-Semite.
Right. Well, they believe everything happened in AD 70, and all of that kind of stuff. But any other questions here? If not, you're really off the hook, Arnold. Thank you so much.